Welcome back, Chapeau. Welcome back to your weekend flip. Saturday on the couch. Got my cup of coffee right here, getting after it. Gonna go to my part-time job at that chocolate milk factory. After this, but I'm super excited that I get to sit here and talk to y'all a little bit about secession crises and a crazy war that apparently lasted over 100 years, right? So the big thing that we have to understand really quick before we start talking about this is we are now moving into a time period known as the late Middle Ages, right? So we're now entering into this period that kind of begins around like 1300, give or take, 1250, depending on what historian you ask, right? So the late Middle Ages is what we're entering into. So give me a new title, right? Give me a title for your notes that says the late Middle Ages, right? And so the late Middle Ages, the thing about it is going to range from about, like I said, about like 1300 to like 1500 AD, depending again on who you ask, right? So the late Middle Ages is going to be a time that is characterized by the following things. 3 things that you need to write down. War, famine, plague. All right, so like basically the late Middle Ages is referred to as a time of general chaos and disorder, right? So it's going to be wars between like different countries that are going to last for an excessive amount of time. It's going to be a lot of different things. But let's go ahead and dive head first into it and talk about the war that kind of defines the late Middle Ages, and it's that known as the 100 Years' War, right? So the 100 Years' War is yet another issue of called secessionary crisis that we talked about early on, right? So like the big thing about it is this right here is the family tree of the ruling dynasty of France, right? So you had Philip III, who was from 1270 to 1285, who actually had a sister that got married to this guy named Charles of Valois, right? Charles of Valois was the royal Valois family in France. He was a noble family in France who's eventually going to give birth to a kid. Well, he doesn't give birth to him, but his descendant, Philip VI, is going to be very important, right? Well, the thing about it is if you keep going down Philip III's original line, his son is going to be Philip IV. And Philip IV is going to have several kids. Louis X, Philip V, Charles IV, and all these men are going to be rulers of France, right? But unfortunately, Louis X died after only ruling for 2 years, right? Philip V died after only ruling for a few extra years, right? And then Charles IV is actually going to die only after ruling for 6 years, right? So the issue that was happening in France, though, is that there was one person related to this original family that was still left alive, and her name was Isabella, right? Isabella is going to get married to a man named Edward II. Key thing about this, though, Isabella was married off to the King of England, right? As kind of this thing known as, like, because women sometimes were used as, like, peace treaties during the Middle Ages, right? So Isabella ends up getting married off to the King of England. They have a child. His name is Edward, right? Edward is destined to become the King of England as well. Well, here's the problem. Charles IV, when he died, he didn't have any sons, all right? None of these guys had any sons. None of them had any daughters. They didn't have kids at all. They have a secession crisis again, right? And so you've got somebody claiming the throne that is not French at all, right? So a giant war is going to break out due to the fact that Edward III of England is going to try and claim the throne of France for himself because he is the closest living relative to the last king, right? Well, the issue here is that the nobles of France don't want this to happen because they believe that it is a terrible idea to let the English king come to France because if the English king rules over France as well, that means that France and England are going to become one combined kingdom, which is not something they want. They speak different languages, they have different cultures, and also there's this old law on the books, right? And you need to write this down really quick. This law was called Salic Law, Salic. So in the Middle Ages period of France, they decided on this new law called Salic Law. And that law said that no man can inherit the throne of France through a woman, right? So Edward III, though, is like, we don't have this law in England. I'm a big tool bag. Look at my goofy face. And I think that I should be king of France. Well, the issue is that the French were like, nah, dog, see right here. Salic Law says you can't be king of France. So we're going to give it to the other closest living male relative, which is that of Philip. The guy who is actually related to this family also by blood, but he's a distant cousin, right? So Philip VI actually ascends the throne as the new king of France, right? Now, Edward III is super upset about this because he believes he should be king of France, and then Philip VI makes everything a little bit worse when he starts trying to tell Edward that you are a subject to my crown, right? So being a subject in a kingdom is a really screwed up thing when you're telling a king that he's now basically a person that hey bro, if you're in France, you ain't king of England anymore, you got to do what I say, right? So when Philip VI takes the throne due to this secession crisis after the death of his cousin Charles, Edward feels that he should control France, right? Since he actually owns land in France, and he's related to Charles by blood. So Edward III, the King of England, actually did own land in France, and he owned this chunk of land down there that's going to become important a little bit later on called Aquitaine, right? So Aquitaine belonged to him. It was considered like regency lands of the English crown, and so he was like, look, I already own land in France, so just let me own all the land in France, right? So Philip said no, and he said, look what's going to happen, big fella. You're going to come to France, and you're going to acknowledge that I am the King of France, and you are going to take a knee, and you're going to swear loyalty to me if you're in France. Edward felt super insulted by this and says, nuh-uh, that ain't happening. And then Philip said, okay, fine, shut up, and I'm going to take all your land away, right? So Philip VI strips all the land from Edward III, and a war breaks out because Edward wants his land back, right? And this war would last for over 100 years, and it's known as the 100 Years' War. The thing about it, though, is why it gets lumped into the Middle Ages is because it's going to cause an excessive amount of death, right? A lot of death, a lot of destruction, and it's going to be a big defining moment to show you that these brand new kingdoms of Europe following the fall of Rome in 476 are now getting to the point where they are politically autonomous, and they're starting to fight major clashes and wars with one another that are dictating the economic standings of a lot of things, right? So the big thing you're looking at this right now is you got to kind of understand that the 100 Years' War went through several different phases, right? So when we're looking at these maps, as you can tell, if everything in green belongs to England, whoa, it looks like England was kicking some butt pretty early on, right? And they actually were. So the things you need to know about the 100 Years' War is, first of all, I could teach half the year on this one war, right? We could sit here all day long and talk about Edward the Black Prince because of his black armor and how he's going to lead England in battle, right? We could talk all day long about Henry V actually ascending the throne and becoming the King of France and England for a time period. And then he dies, and his son, who's only 4 years old, inherits the throne. And then the French are like, no, we don't want that. And we could talk a long time about it. I can tell you all about Charles the Mad, the crazy king of France who thought he was made out of glass, right? So, I can tell you all kinds of stuff. But we don't have that kind of time, right? So we need to know the important details about this war. What about it happened? What's so important about it? What are the major ramifications, right? Well, the thing about it is, it actually lasted longer than 100 years. It's from 1347 to 1453, right? And so that actually accounts for 116 years, right? Now, also really quickly, no war lasts for 100 straight years of battle. There was a lot of peace between. A lot of it has to do with the fact that wars cost a lot of money, and they all kept running out of money, right? And so, also, it's the Middle Ages. Money's not that lucrative or available that much at any time, right? All the money is kind of over in the Indian Ocean, and also in the Byzantine. That's where all the money's being made, right? So England and France didn't have enough money to keep fighting all this war for over 100 years. So there were big chunks of peace between, right? Big, truces. And some of you are probably like, then why don't we call it, that war, that war, that war, that war, that war, that war, right? Why is this all, if they had chunks of peace, then what's going on? Historically speaking, we lump all these battles and all these things together to define a very long conflict that lasted for over 100 years. But could you imagine a war actually starting when you were born and then you don't see the end of it when you die? That's crazy. Now, so, huge amounts of peace, though. And there were truly only really 9 big battles. There's big ones like the Battle of Poitiers, the Battle of Cerisy, the Battle of Agincourt, where Agincourt was crazy. A bunch of French soldiers literally drowned in mud. They were like, oh, we're going to charge the field. Well, it actually rained the night before, and they all got stuck in the mud, and they were getting sucked down into it. And then they look up, and arrows begin to be rained down upon them, right? So that's another major thing about this, this entire understanding of this war, is the advancement of military technology, right? New weapons are going to make major debuts during this war that are going to kind of define the progression of warfare for several hundred years in that of Europe entirely, right? So the thing about it is that the Frenchmen were using an older weapon that they had learned to use from the Romans, right? The Romans were the first ones to originally develop this weapon right here. They're called crossbows, right? So crossbows, though, the problem with them is they're very heavy, they're very big, they're very clunky, they take a long time to reload because you have to have a device where you basically use it as a pulley system to redo the entire thing, and they don't fire arrows, they fire small arrows called bolts, right? And they're not nearly as far going, they're not nearly as accurate, right? So the thing about it is at that Battle of Agincourt, where all those French guys got stuck in the mud, they got picked apart by these people. They're called English longbowmen, right? So you need to write down in your notes, crossbow versus longbow, right? The longbow is where they would actually angle it up in the air and go, phew, and they would let it go, and it would just fly for several hundred yards, and then, and it would just come down and bat and just nail somebody directly, right? And the interesting thing about it is that Englishmen were very well trained in their longbow accuracy, and literally Edward the Black Prince, that guy I was talking about 2 seconds ago that I could talk about all day, wore the black armor, 80% of his armies were actually bow and arrow men, longbowmen, right? And they would pick apart the French armies like all the time. So the thing about it is you saw the progression of military technology, and you're going to see medieval weapons start getting a lot better, right? So, and another big one that actually popped up was gunpowder weapons, right? So since the Chinese had actually developed this in the 9th century BC, it had slowly started making its way over to Europe through cultural diffusion. That's exactly right, Olivia Perez. Good job, right? So now the thing about it, though, is that gunpowder starts making its way over, and the French are actually going to be the ones that learn how to make, like, use cannons and these kind of, like, breech-loading cannons and these goofy... That's the very first gun that ever, like, originated in Europe. It's basically just a stick with a metal rod on the end of it. They're like, pow! So, like, and they were very, very simple, but still, the very first gunpowder weapons that ever be used, which is going to turn the tide of the entire war. Now, also the big thing that you need to understand is, like, using those longbows and using their different military tactics early on, England was crushing France for this entire war, for most of it, right? Now, the other thing you need to understand is that the alliances of this are very, very messy, right? So throughout the war, alliances shifted constantly, and it's what made this war so flinging long, right? So the thing about it is, if we're looking up a map real quick, let's do DMAP. So, all right, after that stupid little song that I was just singing in that fast forward a little bit that we just did that whole way, you have to understand that these alliances were very, very messy. It's what kept this war going for over 116 years, right? Because as the war progressed, a bunch of people in France actually started siding with the English, right? So, like, what's going to end up happening, though, is the reason why that goes down and what ends up going down in general is due to the fact that, there we go, due to the fact that, like, there were these people in France known as the Burgundians, right? So the Burgundians are the people that live over here, right? They live on this eastern side of France, and they were very, very well known for actually processing textiles and making some different things, right? Well, the textiles and the goods that they needed were all coming from England, so they actually economically sided with the English. So it basically was like England and some French people versus a bunch of other French people, right? And these people didn't want the Valois to be in control of France. They wanted somebody else. So you had this really, really crazy thing where it was actually France versus England versus with some other parts of France. And we'll draw the alliances up on the board so it helps you out a little bit when you're going to do your test. And then the other big one that was a messy part of the alliance is France was allied with Scotland, who's on the same island as England. Because the Scottish hate the English. And a lot of that's a bunch of historical stuff as well. So you basically had France and Scotland versus England and this place called Burgundy, right? So Burgundy. So the alliances were super screwed up and very, very messy. And so it kept this war going for so long, right? So getting at it, though, and trying to understand those messy alliances is important. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on. Now, the other thing about it, though, is that the war did break out in 1337, lasted all the way up till 1453. It was fought on and off again, like through periods of peace, English longbowmen. France, though, is eventually going to win, right? And they're going to claim all of France for themselves. And it's mainly due to the interference or the inaction of one particular person that we'll talk about in class. But France was inspired by a super influential figure that actually led them to victory in many key battles, reinvigorating them, crowning a new king of France, and really leading them forward. Well, that's where we're going to stop for right now. We're going to pick up on the second half of the 100 Years' War. We're going to review this stuff in class, but I'll talk to y'all about that soon. Y'all have a great weekend.